Welcome everyone to this session of our conference, which is dedicated to the somewhat somber world of the economy these days. I feel really privileged and indeed humbled to be in the company of so competent people. My name is Dimitar Bechev, and I'm Senior Policy Fellow and Head of the SOFI Office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. These days, we all discuss the economy, and I'm here tempted to paraphrase a certain Leon Trotsky, who said it about war, but it applies to the world of economics as well. Even if you're not interested in the economy is interested in you, and I'm afraid to say not in a good way. What we discuss a lot in this conference is the politics of integration, but we often succumbing to this temptation to discuss the formal steps of integration. About closing chapters, implementing strategies, signing documents. I think what happened in the region over the past decade or so is equally important, and this is the informal side of integration, or the bottom-up, if you will. For all practical purposes, the Western Balkans is already inside the European Union. You can look at trade flows, investments, the structure of the banking sector, migration patterns, and you see, or monetary regimes for that matter, and then you see how much embedded, how much anchored the region is into what we can term European integration, or what it will become after the crisis. And one of the questions, and we have to be frank about it, and when we put it on the table, is asking whether this interdependent relationship is turning into a liability. I think Dusan Relic has been very provocative on this front. We tend to think about European integration in Europe as the anchor for market reform, for democratic consolidation, for governance, upgrades. But we have a crisis for the past few years that has come from the European core into this periphery. And you can also be provocative and call the Balkans the periphery of the periphery. We are very much dependent on countries which are now in the southern tier and make the headlines. What we have seen as well, and this is the starting point of this discussion, is a certain closure. Up until the crisis, there was a growth model that was delivering the goods, not maybe in a good way, not in a productive way, but there was growth in the region. It was fueled by investment, by remittances coming from Western and Southern Europe, and also through the banking sector, through the expansion of credit. Now the crisis had put an effective end to this model. And the question for us, for everyone here in this room, is how we go from here. Are there any glimmers of hope, any silver lining on the horizon, any green sprouts, if you will? Certainly what happens today in core Europe, in the Eurozone, this discussion about the balance between austerity, or as Georgi Ganev would call it, fiscal consolidation, and growth has major implications for us in the region. But also we have our own untapped potential, and our task here is to tease out what are the sources, what are the untapped sources. And I'm really glad to now pass the floor to our first speaker, my dear colleague and friend, Lazar Kekic. Lazar is Director for Europe at the Economist Intelligence Unit and a real authority on all the countries in the region and indeed the broader European setting. So over to you, Lazar, if you could share with us your thought about the state of affairs and where do we go from here?
Okay, thanks very much, Mita. I want to make a few points really as an introduction to what I hope will be an interesting discussion. Now, obviously, looking at the Balkan economies over the last few years, you don't have to be a very close observer or even live in the region to realize things haven't been so good. This followed a good period after the terrible 90s, after 2000 till about 2007, 2008. There was a period of recovery and catch up with the sort of more advanced reformers in Eastern Europe and the developed world. But that unfortunately came to an end with the post-Lehman crisis. If we look at various emerging market regions in the world, undoubtedly this region, Balkan, Southeast Europe, being the politically correct term for it, really suffered worse than any other sub-region. And since 2008, 2009, there's basically been an average stagnation. 2009 saw big falls in output, almost 6% on average, some very, very lame recovery 2010, 2011, which wasn't shared by all countries. As we know, some of the countries in the region are still suffering and in recession. Eurozone will be in recession. That's the key point. There's not very much these small economies can do about that. They're all very highly dependent on the Eurozone, though it is true, as my friend Dusan Rajic said yesterday, EU is not the sole game in town. There are other actors involved in the region. It is still by far and away the main, not just EU, but Eurozone, and in particular, as pointed out, we're talking about a few economies, Germany, Italy, Greece, Austria, on which the Balkans are very, very highly dependent. Now, when you look at the various channels of impact of the Eurozone crisis, Eurozone recession, despite the surprisingly good performance of Germany, we expect Eurozone will be in recession in 2012. And I say, when you look at the various channels of impact, EIU calculated something called the vulnerability index to Eurozone recession, based on indicators such as share of exports to Eurozone, external financing requirement, inward FDI from Eurozone economies, remittances, and a few other obvious factors and channels of impact. And we sort of mix up these various factors and formulate an index of all the former socialist economies, transition economies. The most vulnerable, it turns out, unsurprisingly, probably for most observers, is Hungary. But after Hungary, the three next most vulnerable are Balkan economies, Albania, Croatia, and Serbia. And this is notwithstanding the fact that these countries' share of trade with the Eurozone as percentage of their output is not as high as some of the Central European, but other channels of impact, when you think about it, through remittances, through the role of Western or European banks in the region, through the role of FDI, the exposure is very high. Now, there's not really that much new when you sort of look at the broad historical spectrum over the last 100 years. When you look at the data, which is very interesting to do, the economic history of it, this data, we can thank the late Scottish economic historian Angus Maddison. There's some very valuable figures here. So when you look at this region where it was vis-a-vis developed Europe in 1914 and where it is now, in most cases, it is either at the same level or worse off. So in 100 years, there hasn't really been, on average, any catch-up at all. And the other, in the context of our discussion here and the Eurozone crisis, the other very interesting factoid or empirical regularity is that over these 100 years, which has been a roller coaster ride, politically and economically for this region, the only times when the Balkan economies were catching up with Western Europe was a time when Western Europe was doing well. That's the only time that growth per capita output exceeded in the Balkans that of European averages. When Europe does badly, the Balkans do even worse, and it seems that that regularity is being repeated at the moment. Now, when we look at the main, coming back to the title and the topic of the session, new growth models, I sort of don't really like this term for several reasons. It creates the impression that there's some sort of great scope of choice for policymakers to choose growth models. I mean, the truth be told, there isn't very much. These are small economies, again, to reiterate, very much dependent on developments in the Eurozone. Having said that, not everything is predetermined. There is a little bit of room for policy choices. When we look at it's become commonplace to say that the old growth model is unsustainable. I mean, that's not saying very much. It can't be based on personal consumption, on credit, and high external inflows. But nevertheless, it's very hard to see what exactly policymakers can do and what scope there is for independent policy making or autonomous policy making. Perhaps one area, and that's the last major, I guess, point I really want to make and develop a little here, is when we look at the role of FDI, which I think is crucial. Empirically, it's been shown this is the only form of external capital flow which is sort of conditionally beneficial for economies. All other, in terms of external credits, portfolio inflows, there's very little evidence that they have a positive impact. But FDI empirically has been shown does have a positive impact. And one of the important things that determine FDI is political risk as one of the main components of investment climate. And arguably, we can say there is some room for maneuver here. Policymakers can do certain things to reduce political risk and also improve their investment climate in that respect. Now looking, and this is maybe also a very interesting way to link our discussion with the discussions in the previous session. So I'm almost inclined to invert the famous dictum from Clinton, it's the economy stupid. In many ways, it's the politics stupid in this region that is determining other things, including economic performance. Now, again, linking with previous sections, one thing interesting about political risk and FDI is the somewhat ambiguous relationship between the two. It's not a clear-cut one. There are contradictions. And to give one example, again, we always heard about EU being important and the policies associated with EU membership. But then we look at the two members of the EU in this region. Bulgaria and Romania have had an absolute collapse in FDI since 2009. I mean, Bulgaria, it's still falling, which is quite an extraordinary phenomenon. I know my colleague here in discussion said, well, that's because it was very high level before, but I'm not sure that is a sufficient explanation. Whereas, ironically, on the other side of the spectrum, a country like Serbia actually is one of the rare ones where FDI has been increasing. And even we heard earlier in the session today that a survey of German investors, despite everything, said quite happy doing business in Serbia. Now, why is this? Why is foreign capital, foreign investors immune? When you were listening this morning, it was quite astonishing when you were listening to Mr. Lambsdorff and Mr. Rika. You can, just judging from what they're saying, the hostility and irritation of their comments on Serbia, that not all is right in relations between Serbia and the US and Germany, but doesn't seem to have affected investors. They still keep coming. So this requires explanation. And I'd say there are three reasons for this which touch on our overall topic of discussion. One reason is investors were certainly not stupid. They look at the picture. One, they've discounted the positive news. Things like candidate status is, frankly, they don't really care very much about it for several reasons. First of all, in terms of prospective membership and so on, it's so far away. Secondly, they don't think in today's world where Eurozone and EU in crisis that it even brings that many advantages. In some respects, there's even advantages of being left out in terms of you can give special incentive to investors. And the third important point is they also discount the danger of punitive action. They don't think the investment climate will be affected by, say, punitive action by Germany and other countries to withhold some of the important benefits like visa-free regimes, the foreign trade liberalization. It would take a lot to anger the powers that be to take punitive action. So I think investors have taken all that into account.
So there's some silver lining in the Serbia story. But maybe we should stop on this point, and I'm sure there'll be people coming back.
Well, just one last point, and that's exactly why I want to stop, because I want to also link with something that I think linked to this whole issue, an important point that colleague Tim Judah raised yesterday, how it seems that the Balkans at the moment seem politically stable compared to other countries, regions in the world. Not much is happening. Certainly it's off CNN. I guess the term I would use, this great complacency now suddenly about the Balkans. Now, is it justified? I think it's on the argument is a knife edge. And that is interesting to see what the discussion will bring out. On the one hand, you can argue that this new state of affairs is something lasting. It's not ephemeral. I think there's arguments you can make in favor. But on the other side of the coin, you could also make an argument that it could be the quiet before the storm. When we heard about all the bad results of various surveys on the intense dissatisfaction of populations, the high unemployment. So is it just a matter of time before this spills over into a more nasty politics? I'll stop there.
So we're locked in this tough choice between a bad equilibrium and stagnation and a quiet before the storm, and you don't know which might be worse. But over now to Georgi Ganev, who is a colleague of mine. We work together at the Center for Liberal Strategies. He's program director and the chief economist of CLS, and always, as a macroeconomist, a source of optimism. I mean, one thing that Laza said is that convergence is tricky historically in catching up. Maybe you can also address this point, but also share your opinions about the region and potential for growth in a very austere way, because we're budgeting time.
Yes, thank you, Dimo. I have to agree with Laza on the basic point, and the basic point is that our region, the Balkans here, we are perpetually converging, and when you look a century later, his mention of the Angus Madison data was exactly on target there. We have not converged. The reason is, and this is actually not such an idiosyncratic feature of the Balkans. The Nobel Prize winning economic historian Douglas North has actually observed that usually poor countries or poorer countries are catching up very well during the good times. The problem with the poorer countries, which is opposed to the richer countries, at least until this last great recession, is that when the bad times come, they really flop, as opposed to the richer countries which go through milder type of recessions. It's the bad times that are usually the problem with the catching up process. During the good times, we do manage to catch up. So in that sense, we can see that there is room for some optimism here for the Balkans, even though we have to qualify it, because as Laza said, you don't know, it may be tomorrow that something unravels in terms of flopping during the bad times. But so far, the region has held out reasonably well during this global bad times period. It has not, well, probably except Greece. It has not floundered, it has not become a source of problems for everybody else, as it usually promptly does. So far, polities and economies are holding up reasonably well, again, during bad times. Even in terms of aggregate dynamics, some of the countries are actually exhibiting, including Serbia, not so bad aggregate dynamics. Bulgaria and Romania, of course, are tied to the problems of the Eurozone, but even there, they don't have larger flops than EU as a whole. So we can say that this time, at least so far, the region is holding out pretty well during the storm. It may unravel. We're not out of the woods yet by any means, but the optimistic point of view would say, but usually by that time we're already down the drain. So this is probably a historical first. On the question of growth, I also agree with Laza that, I mean, it's not like you have a menu of growths and you pick the most delicious one to your taste. It's definitely not like that. My exercise is more like what's most likely to happen in the region in the next phase of good times, because growth is about long-term increasing your productive capacity rather than just recovering from the recession. And here there's two things. First of all, there's diversity in the region. Some countries will grow in one manner, other countries will grow in another manner. But there are some challenges that are facing all of these countries, with probably very small exceptions, like, let's say, Kosovo. One of those problems, and probably the major one, is the demography, and especially what we economists would call the human capital aspect of growth, namely the number of people, the age of people, the economic activity of people, how many people participate actively in economic life rather than stay out, qualification, education of the people, health of the people, and of course, tangential to it, but also highly related, is the issue of innovation, especially entrepreneurial innovation. This is, to me, this is the major challenge, because all of these societies have negative demographic dynamics, except probably Kosovo again. They're going to face problems. They're going to face budgetary problems even within a foreseeable future even if longer, like 20, 30 years ahead of us. And they have to prepare for these challenges, have to meet them, which means reforms. Now, we've done reforms, we know about reforms. We're relatively more flexible than many other societies on earth in doing reforms, but still, the political challenge is there. So again, I would also say that politics is a very important, extremely probably the most important aspect of the mix. To be prepared, to be flexible, to be able to take the shocks, work them out, go through the crisis, but then come out stronger on the other side, which is what the rich countries have done, and that's the reason why they are rich too. Not because they're growing during the good times, but they were facing the bad times more productively than we did.
I probably should make a political point that at the end of the day, it's the quality of institutions and public policy we have to discuss, but I'm sure there'll be questions on this one. But now, we had the economists and the macro people on this side. Intentionally, we put people from business and the micro level on this other side to share their experiences, how they develop businesses in this part of the world. Now, the first speaker on the business side is Cvetan Ložanský, who is advisor to the supervisory board of Devin AD. So over to you, Cvetan, to share some of your observations. I mean, what is the way forward? If I can elicit some optimism on your side.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think business people have to be optimistic always. When I was thinking what I shall be discussing, I thought that maybe I present a little bit of challenging view, because always when we are discussing about our region, we're discussing about catching up, and somebody has to give us something, and the rich economies, we have to catch up. So there is always this sort of laggard mentality. And I was thinking, okay, we'll catch up, we'll do structural reform, all these things. But is there a brighter vision than that? Because there should be always something that is more appealing, at least to make these countries more excited about their future. And I'm also a big fan of natural competitive advantage. So I was thinking, is there a thing that makes us very unique? Is there something that our region could bring to the world, as opposed to us always expecting to receive and to kind of gain from established business models? Because typically that's what we do. There is some large foreign investor, he comes with the established business model, we take part or whatever of this business, and we feel very happy that we are catching up. So my thinking was that there should be something that unifies our region, and I was thinking, is there something that is in the past, in our culture, in the way we were brought up, maybe the way, where we are positioned, that would provide some feature on which we can build something new, and this would be our contribution to a bigger world. So that's what I came up with. I was thinking that first, we're southern nations pretty much, so we are very emotional people. And second, what is very interesting is that we're all unified by the fact that we didn't have enough time to kind of get this hardcore capitalistic mentality or the prevailing business models of the last hundreds years. So we didn't get these embedded in our heads. So I speak about Bulgaria now, Romania, countries where I've done business, but I also have observations on some Western countries like Serbia, Montenegro, etc. And I think people during these 20 years were kind of lost with this model that we are catching up to, because we didn't get it naturally, didn't come naturally. We didn't have hundreds of years to get it. So based on these two things, southern nation more emotional, and this lack of embedded hardcore capitalism, I was thinking that we may be a test ground for new business models. And maybe 10 years ago, this wouldn't be so valid, because 10 years ago, world was kind of going ahead and everything was great. But now we see that the old business models could at least be discussed. I mean, they are under discussion. And I was thinking maybe we can be a test ground for business models which are more win-win. This is the word, you know, social responsibility, or models where we create something which contributes better to society. Luckily, our region is totally underdeveloped in this sort of stuff, which provides huge opportunity. So I was thinking, okay, then our way forward may be to do something unique, to test new business models that are working better for society, serving a lot of purpose, and they suit much better our mentality, because when you're more emotional, you naturally connect with other people. You want to contribute something. So that is the point of view that I try to make.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting debate shaping up already, because this side of the table said basically you're underdeveloped, you're on the periphery, you don't have that much wiggle room, you depend on what goes on in the core economies. Whereas you're saying, you know, underdevelopment and lack of certain institutional legacies might be a chance.
I think it's a big opportunity for us to become a test ground for these new business models. But
I'm sure there will be reactions on this one as well. But speaking of business models, I'm really pleased to present the last speaker on this panel, Elvin Guri. Elvin is both Albanian and Bulgarian. Originally from Albania, he built a business in Bulgaria. He's been very successful with Styx Capital and previously other ventures in the financial sector. So Elvin, how do you see all those questions about the potential, not only in Bulgaria, but also in the wider region? Because we were discussing this perennial issue, is regional cooperation a bad thing, or maybe the way forward?
Well, I feel as an Albanian, I can start with a self-deprecating Albanian joke. The end of the world is coming in a week, and everyone is rushing around to do the last things they do before everything disappears. Only the Albanians seem to go about their business as usual. And when asked, don't you know that the end of the world is coming? The answer is, oh, well, we're 100 years behind, so until it gets to us. I think this is a good illustration, an example of not just the extent of the isolation that the economies of the economies of the Western Balkans had from the global economy, but also an illustration of the sophistication of local political and business elites about what to expect out of an eventual integration. In that sense, I think that the crisis that we're going through right now is not an economic crisis as much as it is a crisis of values, a crisis of priorities. We built our growth, if at all that can be called a model, during the past 20 years, on the basic of catching up, convergence. Economic convergence without necessarily convergence of values. Essentially, we wanted the EU money without their rules. And that clearly has created an internal crisis, economic crisis, not just a fallout from the global economic crisis. In Romania, in Bulgaria, in Albania, in Serbia, the level of non-performing loans in the banking sector is huge. We're talking 22% in this country. We're talking 18 to 20% in Albania and in Romania. This cannot be just the result of the global economic crisis. In that respect, I feel that this is an opportunity, should be taken as an opportunity for fundamental restructuring, not just of the economic fundamentals of these economies, but also of political and value systems. Even in the good old times, it was impossible to sell the Western Balkans to good strategic investors for several reasons. Political risk, something else that all of us know, but none of us speaks out loud, which is differences in mentality, differences in sophistication in values and in education, and finally, market potential. A former partner of McKinsey financial institutions practice told me a mediocre job in Turkey would make me a lot more money than an excellent job in Bulgaria. That illustrates also the quality of the FDI that the region managed to attract. With the exception of the banking sector and some notable examples on auto industry, what we were getting in the Western Balkans was basically mediocre, opportunistic, small-time investors from Italy and from Greece. So the growth of the region was skewed towards such short-term, opportunistic models. Look at the betonization of the Black Sea of Bulgaria, for instance, or of the Albanian coast side. In that sense, it's, at least to me, it's obvious that the retrenchment of Western investment interests from this part of the world, their repositioning or their withdrawing, is something that will affect the region not just in the short term, but medium term and even longer term. That creates a vacuum that can be exploited. I would personally like to exploit in the region, both in the banking sector and outside the banking sector. Most of us that live here have no choice. We cannot just pack up and leave, like the foreign investors are doing. Therefore, to me and to others like me, the only way to go is to find out whether there are opportunities in the region. There are certain implications for that, of this, for the Western Balkans and for the Balkans at large. First and foremost, there's no strategic investors anymore for the next 5 years. Get used to the fact that you'll see financial investors, that you'll see regional investors coming in. The only way to make your country attractive for foreign investors is to go out and build a regional platform, a regional market. And it's not going to be done by political will, it's going to be done by economic will. Economic integration will precede the political integration. Economic integration should bring about the integration in values that will ultimately lead to political integration. Finally, we should all take this opportunity and invest in education. Not just give out licenses for universities like Albania has done, but really overhaul the fundamental what represents education in these countries. Bulgarian youth rated last in an EU overall survey of education, culture in general. Last. It's a disaster. I happen to be privileged and lucky to be involved with my alma mater, which is the American University in Bulgaria, in which there are 40 nationalities, a large part of which, overwhelming part of which, come from the Balkans. This is the type of initiatives that we should learn from, and this is the type of initiatives that we should try to apply in our countries.
Well, thanks for this very strong statement, and maybe to be the devil's advocate, and there's the problem of hubs and spokes in the region, and for us to trade together, and this is something we've chewed upon for many years. But before I open for questions and answers, let me pose the first question, and it has to do with the crisis in Greece. So if you get your kind of crystal ball, what will be the implications for us in the neighborhoods? Is there a doom and gloom scenario, or is it just more of the same, and we're not as vulnerable as kind of sensationalist headlines would probably have it? But over to the audience now. Questions? Yes? If you could introduce yourself.
Erhan Türbedar, foreign policy analyst from Turkey. When in 2009, negative effects of global economic crisis started to have its effects on the Balkans, I was one to argue that this is important opportunity for the Balkan states, because it was for the first time that the politicians in this region, especially in the Western Balkans, started in serious way to think about economic growth and think about economy. Unfortunately, for many years, economic issues were not number one issue for for the countries of this region. And my question is about financial stability now. In order to have one successful economic growth, this is you have to have one healthy financial system also. And when you look to the financial system of this country, you will see that more than 90% of shares of financial sector belongs to the banking sector. And previously, just a few years ago, the banking sector of these countries, especially the former centrally planned countries, the financial sector, banking sector was dominated by state. And now we have a situation when more than 90% of shares of Balkan sector, of banking sector in the many Balkan countries belongs to the foreign banks. Is this some kind of vulnerability for the Balkan countries in the when I speak about economic growth? Since just a few years ago, when the economic crisis started, we saw that some increase in interest rates. We saw that for private sector was more difficult to get credit. So I would like to hear the assessment about current economic situation of the financial stability in the Balkan countries, and maybe to hear how future developments in the Eurozone will have its reflections to the financial stability in the Balkans, since many regions. Thank you.
Žiro Zaskalski.
Hi, I'm Žiro Zaskalski from the Center for Research and Policy Making from Macedonia. I have a question for Mr. Kekic. What kind of impact will Croatian accession to EU and exit from CEFTA have on the former Yugoslav economies in various sectors, including dairy production, food production, and so on?
Jelica Milic.
I'm Jelica Minic from Regional Cooperation Council in Sarajevo. I would like to support your right wing. From your point of view, it's left wing.
Yeah, it looked very left to me.
I would like to support them very much because they raise the issue of building new interest groups, new interest structures in the region. It's a long-term process. We are studying and mapping everything that is going on in the region. And if you watch sectoral cooperation in different areas, not only economic, police, judiciary, defense sector, infrastructure, you can see exponential growth of regional cooperation. And political cooperation is going like that, oscillating, but following the curve. So political cooperation is not the precondition. Good political cooperation is a consequence of integrating societies in the region. Second, we have to wait for European integration. I'm completely sure that we are going to join European Union. There cannot remain a pocket inside, so it's impossible. Because if we only take infrastructure or security or organized crime or whatever, but it's a question of timing. We cannot just sit and wait and fulfill conditionality. We should work on vision building. We are invited by the European Commission from 2013 on to approach European funds, instrument for pre-accession assistance, only if we have a clear vision about sectoral development in each area, what means general development idea. There are groups now working on aligning our region with Europe 2020, Western Balkans with Europe 2020. And the next meeting will be very soon in Bled, where people from ministries of finance, from ministries of economy, experts, academia are going to discuss how to design in the best way the model for our region, because we cannot just replicate. So there are so many developments under the surface, and we were discussing these 2 days only the surface, the tip of the iceberg.
There will be many more meetings, obviously.
So I hope there will be many more meetings where these deep processes that are going on could become visible. And this invitation for vision building, future-oriented principles, objectives, mechanisms came also from Turkish side. It's Davutoglu's, Minister Davutoglu's concept inviting the whole region to think about in these terms what we can bring to Europe, not only what Europe can give to us. Sure. So my support to right, left wing.
Let's go back to the speakers and work our way in reverse order. So over to you, Elvin, if you could address some of those points and questions raised.
Well, I could speak about the financial sector. There's certainly going to be a fallout. I mean, it's happening. It's already happened. There's no credit to SMEs or to individuals across the Balkans. In addition to that, there's complete unwillingness to restructure the sector. It's not just unwillingness, it's as our interlocutor said, there's lack of capability. There's not much that one can do since decisions are being taken elsewhere in Europe, in the headquarters of these particular banks. But as I see it, there is an unholy alliance of interests that does not allow for the restructuring of the banking sectors. There's managers of the banks who are primarily responsible for bringing us into this mess. There's the owners of these banks who are not interested in recognizing losses because that will mean more capital. And they've got much bigger holes to plug in elsewhere. Third, there's the regulators that simply are not interested to have more issues and more problems come out into the open. And we as consumers are not interested to hear about another set of problems in our economies and in our lives. And these are all coalescing into a, I think it's a, quiet before the storm. I don't like it much, but I have no solution to it. I can see opportunities for individual investors to go in and start building market shares, not because the markets are growing, but simply by taking market shares by people and institutions that are not willing to have the same presence as they used to have before. As a matter of fact, at this point, I'm involved in a banking acquisition in Romania from a German bank. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Very good. Stefan?
Yeah, I just listened to all these discussions and I cannot cope but thinking that we just have to get rid of this mentality. I mean, we are not dependent on anybody. We're dependent on ourselves. And my view is very micro view, which is what am I doing? What am I contributing? And we just have to get rid of this. What is somebody else going to give me? I mean, it's irrelevant because we're totally lacking control over these big events. I mean, somebody is putting Basel III out there for their own reasons and their own crisis, etc. We are part of this, but we really cannot influence it so much. So let's think at the micro level. What am I doing? I think that's really the message. And I agree with the supporter of right, left wing. There is a lot going on right now. And in the world, there is a lot going on. And I have a son that's kind of in the teenage years. These guys are thinking completely different things. They don't care about all these big things. So everybody should think, what am I doing?
Well, there's something encouraging to think about a Balkan panel in terms of right and left as opposed to my country versus your country and my ethnicity. But Georgi.
Yes, I will address two issues. One is the question on the financial system and the financial stability, and the other is again this relation that the macro-micro. On the financial stability, while I think Elvin is completely right that there may probably many problems that are hidden behind the balances in the region. It is a fact that the incentives to hide the problems are everywhere on earth. In some places they couldn't hide them. So the mere fact that in the Balkans they're still hidden 4 years into a large financial crisis is, I think, without a precedent in the history of the Balkans. Usually the problems start here rather than the opposite. This is an argument I'm having with my colleague at the center, Rumen Avramov, who is always the pessimist, the gloomy, the end of the world type of guy.
Historian.
He's the historian. He's the economic historian. Again, what is it that makes the financial sector more resilient this time? And my answer to that is that actually the way they approached the crisis was, of course, they got cut off from money inflows from their mothers. That was tough, but then they discovered that there's this underdeveloped deposit base in the countries they're in. So they've sucked out a lot more deposits from the population as a whole than they did before, which is ultimately not so bad, not such a bad thing. But of course they had to cut on credit, and of course they were running away from risk. So your point about SMEs and individuals is absolutely well taken. Now the question is, how much problems do we have under the rug? We don't know. It may turn out that they're not big enough to succumb the whole system, but it may turn out that they're serious and they'll show up at some point. So the question about the financial stability is, we don't know yet. However, a sign about the region is that 4 years into a major crisis, there has not been a financial meltdown in the region. Even in Greece, there has not been a financial meltdown. Now, on the micro-macro issue, I want to say that for the micro entrepreneurs, I mean the people who make individual decisions, what am I doing? They're trying to answer the question, what am I doing in this situation? A very important aspect of the environment is what kind of options they face and how free they are to choose and to take risks, and of course to experiment with entrepreneurial innovations or new business models, as Cvetan calls it. And that depends on how the macro environment is structured, which is again a policy issue. I think that one of the messages might be emerging here is that the Balkans may have a long-term competitive advantage by providing their entrepreneurs with better environment for experimenting, more encouraging. Yeah.
Good. Naz, would you agree with the positive message that is shaping up?
Well, I don't know. Let me deal with the 3 points, and at the end of them, you can see whether I do or not. I picked up 3 points. Some of the questions were aimed directly to me, and some were general points. Point number 1, as somebody mentioned the old saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste, or something to that effect, that crisis as opportunity. I have to say I've always been sort of a bit skeptical of this dictum, and nothing that's happened in the region over the last 3 years causes me to reevaluate my skepticism. You know, nobody's going around using this crisis as an opportunity for anything. The second point that was raised, or a question asked, Croatian membership of the EU, the demise of Croatia's membership of CEFTA, what impact on the region? And this whole question of regional cooperation, which Dimitar said, we keep going round and round for years. I really don't want to sound too cynical about it. You know, the Americans have a phrase, motherhood and apple pie. You know, who can be against regional friendship and cooperation? But exactly, yeah. So, but in economic terms, one really does have to say it amounts to very, very little. In some cases, literally zero. If you look at some of our economies, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, I mean, intra-regional trade is practically nothing. The one big relationship traditionally economic between Croatia and Serbia has never revived since, you know, the demise of Yugoslavia. The caveat to this, and the serious issue, I think, is for Bosnia and Herzegovina, that this EU accession of Croatia will cause some problems there, which is exercising minds. But with that exception, otherwise, it's really much ado about little. Now, the third point that was raised, you know, again, touching upon some of the discussion yesterday, so what can the region expect if there is this tsunami from its point of view, some sort of Eurozone disintegration? I'm afraid, you know, there's very few reassuring things one can say there, with perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions. There are advantages in this respect of backwardness, I guess you could say, cushions. One, high agricultural dependence, in this case, is some sort of reassurance that even in the midst of a great crisis, the chances of people in this region, you know, going absolutely hungry are less than in others. Another one springs to mind when, you know, colleagues in Northern Europe say, how Has Spain not imploded? When you look at the data there, it's just horrific. And the obvious answer is the role of the family and the extended family. It's still a going concern. And to a large extent, the southern phenomenon affects the Balkans as well. So there is some sort of cushion. But if the Eurozone does implode, which we discussed this yesterday, I can tell you that my organization has for some time put the chances, which I personally still think is about realistic risk probability, at 40%. As you know, many other observers are putting now the chances of a Eurozone demise way higher than that. But in that case, again, even with the caveats of these cushions, there would be very little news. I can't see how you can put any sort of positive spin on that for the Balkans.
Ambassador Molas wanted to ask a question.
Well, yes, the way that I'm asking questions is that I try to respond myself. On three points, if you allow me. First, I have a great respect for economists because I do not deny that my original profession was an economist myself. So, but I think that very few economists truly succeeded in avoiding crisis, and secondly, doing the right prognosis. I think it's a great debate yesterday and today, but yet we're failing to address the issues that affect the people. And that is why this very generous package that was given to Greece by European Union has not been understood by the Greeks themselves. So there's a lack of calibration of the message. I tried to say yesterday, but not very successfully, I feel that in Greece there are 10 million Greeks and 1,400,000, roughly, migrants coming from the neighboring countries. Legal. There are not those who come through Turkey and the Evros border. Out of them, maybe there are 800,000 to 1 million Albanians, and that maybe explains the reason why there has not been an Albanian float towards Italy. I think there are 250 Albanians working in Italy. So it's 50% of the Albanians' economically active population is right now outside Albania. The xenophobic syndromes that are very present in Central Europe the last 40 or 50 years were not much present or reflected in domestic politics in Greece for the last 20 years. They are coming very recently. My prognosis is the following. As we don't foresee an exit from the present job crisis, to say things with their own name, lack of jobs. The remittances, mostly of the Albanian migrants, will go even lower, as they have been the last 2 years. They are pumping from their savings in the Greek banks, or banks in Tirana and elsewhere. But I think as from September, they all made their bed with their families and themselves. Let's wait to see what's going to happen in the summer. The tourist industry, who contributes to 18 to 20% to the Greek GDP. By September or October, we may see, unfortunately, that there is a massive flow of interim returnees, let's call them back home. Those who have children, school age, will try to find an accommodation with families and relatives to keep them in Greece. But others will try to seek maybe an opportunity and back home. This is going to be increasingly an economic, social, but also in political issue at their countries of origin.
Would you have a question to
this has to be addressed now and being also an issue to be presented in the European Union institutions.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sorin Ionica.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorin Ionica from Expert Forum, Romanian think tank. I have to revert back to the question if we are going to squander this crisis or not in the Balkans, but from a different angle. And that angle is that we shouldn't be so provincial maybe in analyzing the current events. Because for most countries in the Balkans, two things are true, and I share the relative optimism of Georgi. First, that the 90s, which were much worse in many countries. There was meltdown basically in Bulgaria, in Albania, Romania, everywhere. So socially and economically, that was much worse than we see today. The difference is that we had the EU that was functioning, and we saw it as a model, and we were hoping to join it, and that changed the expectation. We've been through these very bad times, but we had, an objective. Now, after accession for some countries and for the others, now the problem is we are better off than when we started in 91, 92, definitely by any indicator, probably except those parts of ex-Yugoslavia where there was open conflict and they were under embargo. And so in those places, people are really worse off than at the beginning. But all the others, I think, they are better off objectively. Is it just a factor of our high expectations that increased meanwhile, and now we lost, our goal? The EU has problems, and we don't know. There's a certain, fatigue. Can we do again now use this crisis to pursue internal structural adjustment the way we did in the 90s, actually, with results? And we've been through 2 cycles, as Georgi said. But at the end of it, we are above the level when we started. So it was not just we came back after adjustment where we started. It was a spiral going upwards for many countries in the Balkans. Are we going to squander this crisis because we lost the model, which is the European Union, or not? Or we can focus on the micro things where we have strength and resilience in the region. Thank you.
Cyrus Reed is the next one.
Well, first of all, Elvin, I want to congratulate you for saying that we should invest in institutions like mine. And if any of you would like to talk to me about how you can invest in educational opportunities at AUBG, I'd be happy to have you that conversation. In addition to shameless self-promotion, I have a question for you. Crises lead to opportunities for consolidation. Whenever there's an economic crisis, people with wealth can make strategic investments. It seems to me, as a relative newcomer to this part of the world, there are 2 sources of wealth. There are people who can explain where their wealth came from, and there are people who can't explain where their wealth came from. And this is really kind of a tricky time, because if the people who have created wealth through productive activities expand their investments, then the economically rational part of the economy will expand. If people whose wealth has come from non-economic activities expand their consolidate their control over the economy, then we may have interesting opportunities that will lead to an increasingly dysfunctional economy. And which way do you see this going?
There was a question at the back.
Thank you. My name is Stoichov Vlaikov, and I'm an entrepreneur who lived in the EU and abroad for a while, then came back, had a company, sold it, went away. Now I'm thinking again about starting something new. 2 questions, one more macro, and nobody seems to be talking here about the big gorilla next door, which is powering ahead, and this is Turkey. And if that might be instead of begging China and Qatar for money and investment, there's so many cultural things. Speaking of cultural similarities between this region and history as well, which seems to be usually a problem. If you see at projections where Turkey is going to be in 10 and 20 years, one begs the question, should we always look into Germany or maybe to Turkey? So that's one question. The second question is, coming back to the education issue, well, the EU is great in many ways, also great because you join the EU and usually the smart young people go there right away. So that has happened to most of these countries in this region. The question is, any ideas of how to bring them back?
So back to the panelists, but work in the original order. So over to you, Laza.
Well, I guess this point on Turkey is an interesting one. It was raised yesterday as well. Turkey's been doing relatively well, which tends to be maybe lost sight of those who are looking at Balkans defined as the former communist Balkans. is this a model that can be copied, or is Turkey even, alternative supplier of capital and other things to Western Europe? I mean, it's a good question. It's easier to reject and say no when people raise the possibility of Russia stepping in. I think that's an easier case to make, that Russia cannot be substitute for West European. With Turkey, maybe it's less obvious, because Turkey is not just a mono economy like Russia. It's even more dynamic than Russia, though it's much, much smaller. And in some ways, Turkey, despite its strong development in recent times, is still quite a poor one. So sometimes you get the impression that some Turkey's ambitions might actually, for the moment, outstrip its capacity. So I would sort of reserve some skepticism, though not as much as in the case of Russia. But, frankly, to be brief, this is, I think, a valid question, a valid subject for discussion. My answer would still be no. Turkey cannot substitute for the EU.
Okay, let me address the issue with Turkey again, especially when you look at Turkey from Bulgaria. It's really big. And you don't even have to look at the whole Turkey. Istanbul is pretty much enough. So yeah, definitely economically, I'm not talking about other issues that always get raised when the question about Turkey arises. Economically, Bulgaria can only win from better integration with Turkey. From what Elvin mentioned in his main presentation, basically, I completely agree. If you are economically integrated with Turkey, and especially this market, which is Istanbul, which is about 4 times Bulgaria economically, it's double the population, double the living standard of Bulgaria. It will make Bulgaria a more interesting hub for many investments. Not only that, but also you can explore all kinds of gains from trade, because there's a lot of trade opportunities between the two countries. Probably that's not so much the case for other Balkan countries, however. And there, what Laza said, that Turkey cannot provide this capital, this dynamic that the EU can to these countries is correct.
So the other possible caveat, to paraphrase our sister magazine, who might be wrong, might be right, but there was an interesting sort of warning article a few weeks now, maybe a couple of months ago, that Turkey might be the next success story heading for a fall. There's always bad news around the corner, and what they emphasized, again, I don't know if they're right or not, but they did emphasize a number of features of the Turkish economy that made it possibly vulnerable to...
Well, the current account deficit is
striking. For one, yeah.
Yes, that is also true. So Turkey is not out of the woods in terms of being this vulnerable, prone to go in downturns country like the rest of the Balkans. On what Sorin said, I think your point is excellent. This is another horizon or level where we, the countries in the Balkans, should start perceiving ourselves, especially now when Croatia also enters the EU. Part of what I said, having a macro environment which is supportive for micro-experimenting, looking for new models, being inventive, has to be solved in Brussels. It has to be solved at the EU level, because the EU business environment is not the best on earth by far. And we can influence. And not only we can, we should influence, because a part of the whole environment is a common decision. So the horizon is actually not just sitting there in the councils and waiting what everybody else has to say and agreeing. It's more like we have to voice what we see as necessary changes in the EU structure, so that our competitive advantages, like the ones that Elvin and Svetan were mentioning, micro-level advantages, have the best opportunity to succeed.
So, but what's your recipe? No tax harmonization, or is positive beyond just
No,
saying no?
this is a very technical issue. Ultimately, the tax harmonization is probably, yeah, it does affect the returns to entrepreneurs, of course. But as we know, low taxes, as we've discovered in Bulgaria, low taxes are necessary but not sufficient conditions for all kinds of nice things. Low taxes create interest, but entrepreneurs stick to a country for other reasons that are probably more important in the long run. And these other reasons that are more important in the long run include flexibility, upward and downward flexibility of prices, include flexibility of business models, includes access to markets, and many other features which are important and have to be decided on EU level because the rigidities seem to be generating from there. And on the issue of Ambassador Milias, with especially the migrant flows, economic migrant flows, I think that I completely agree. This is a very important aspect. I think the most important channel through which a meltdown in Greece would actually affect the rest of the Balkans. It's not going to go through the banking system. I don't think that's a big danger there. It's not going to go through trade or something. It's going to go through people who will not be able to work or generate the desired incomes in Greece, who are going to come back to their countries, and that might, unless these countries are flexibly again prepared to take them in, they might create all kinds of problems.
Right. Svetlana?
I have my particular opinion on two of the questions, and one of them was coming from the gentleman there. Are we going to miss the crisis as an opportunity to change? That's my read of the question. And the second was how to bring the people back, because I'm involved with different non-for-profit initiatives that kind of have the purpose of retaining people in Bulgaria in particular. And here on the first question, I would really build on what Elvin was saying about values. I am sure that all of the people present here understand his point that this crisis is about values. And it is, for me, a total change of mentality and mindset. And it is just coming, and whoever does not see it coming is probably blind. I don't know. So we have to use this crisis, but not only for the regular stuff, which is the reforms, etc., but just to give a clear message that what we're doing so far is already exhausted as a model. So there should be a change in values, and there is a lot of politicians here. This message could be coming from you on the macro level, because on the micro or whatever lower level below the tip of the iceberg, people are doing it, people are aware of it. So what I see is already kind of discrepancy of what these guys up there are talking about and what our life is. And this discrepancy is getting even bigger and bigger, and I think sometimes we're living in two parallel worlds. What we're doing and what these guys are talking about doesn't make a connection. So this crisis should not be missed by politicians on the macro level, just to send the message, we have to do something in a different way. And it should be in an entirely different way, in an entirely different mindset, because all the other things are only going to lead us to this catch-up game. We're doing something, they're doing something, we're not catching up, we're frustrated, nothing nice. And then, if this is done by everybody, I think the question of how to bring the people back is kind of answered. Because people, they are coming attracted by the opportunities, and I think in our region there is millions of opportunities. It's just hard to cope with all these opportunities. And what it lacks is the vision. Why I should go there? Is it only to make money, or is it for me to feel comfortable and nice? And when there is this general vision, I think people will just come here. And there is a lot of expats who come to Bulgaria and they say, we were crying when we were coming, we were crying when we were leaving. So there is something nice here. And I think if we add vision to all these nice things, here is the answer.
If I may try to address a few of the questions, starting with Soren's. I don't think there's so much fatigue in the Balkans about EU as much as there is a reflection of the general malaise in the whole of Europe. The real fatigue, I think, is in the EU and in the US, who've had enough with squabbling politicians behaving like spoiled children. As a young parent, I've been learning the hard way that you cannot bribe your child into behaving. Why should it be and it's not any different with politicians. In addition, EU itself is facing so much, and both in terms of dimensional and in terms of conceptual change within itself, that there will be some time before they can face the Balkans with a different set of requirements and a much stronger view about what they should expect. The politicians are not going to change. So from my point of view, what should happen and what's incumbent on the older EU members of the Balkans, such as Romania and Bulgaria, is to take advantage of this opportunity and to encourage their business class, their entrepreneurs, to expand in the Western Balkans. We have, despite the fact that by and large that kind of integration has not been attractive for most of these, for most business people, there are excellent examples of cross-border cooperation and investment, whether it's between Romania and Bulgaria, or whether it's in the former Yugoslavia space, or whether it's investment from Turkish interest in the Balkans. There is such thing, and that must be encouraged. Having said that, I don't think that Turkey, I agree with the previous speakers that Turkey is not that good, that big of an opportunity as an investment source. And I would add to them that part of the reason is also the sophistication of the business interests that would consider the Balkans as a practical investment opportunity. They tried once in the 90s, where their banks were coming in alongside the Greeks, but they suffered through their own internal crisis, and they really shipped themselves back. And those wounds are still open. Turkish banks that have been looking at the sector have been extremely, extremely cautious about where they go and what they do. And they start with those countries or those environments that they know better, such as Kosovo or Albania or Macedonia. I don't think these days they're seeing much better opportunities in CIS, Northern Iraq, Sudan, Libya, and so on. So we're not bound to see any strong interest from very good bona fide investors from Turkey. As far as the size question on opportunity for consolidation and whether this is going to come from people with legit wealth or non-legit wealth, I think people with non-legit wealth have hidden their money. It's not going to come out anytime soon. It shouldn't come out anytime soon, especially those that have criminal origin. For the rest, let's be honest about it. If the governments want to do something about it, let them declare a tax amnesty. Look at Italy, they're doing it every couple of years now. You know? But the real opportunity is going to come from those people, those entrepreneurs with legitimate sources of wealth who are going to find sufficient support from good investors from outside. It's going to be extremely difficult. It took me 3 years to put together an investor consortium to start investing in financial institutions in this part of the world. Halfway through the process, I lost half of the investors because they preferred to move to Southeast Asia. I go and visit them in Singapore. He shows me out of the window and says, look at it. What would I do in Romania and Bulgaria and Western Balkans? He's got a point, you know?
So it's very difficult as a chair to do justice in summarizing such a rich and variegated and deep, thorough panel. If I could just sum up some of the pessimist points, and I mean, it was overall frank discussion and somewhat somber, but pessimism didn't prevail, but there were some points made. One is that the crisis might well go unused. And the other one is that Greece won't produce this shock effect. There won't be a tsunami, but there will be a series of small waves through migration that will be felt badly. But let's focus on the positive points made. First positive point was that the storm so far has been swept under the rug and hasn't produced such a meltdown. And Lazar told us that actually some countries have done better in terms of FDI. Georgi have also shared with us that saving rates have gone up because of the crisis. So this is something to take a positive view upon. And we also learned that the business environment has a lot of potential, be it at a level of a single country, but also cross-border and regionally. So let me just congratulate all the panelists, and please join me in thanking them for this excellent and very stimulating, enriching discussion. I think that was a very good contribution to the conference.
Thank you. Thank you.